Good morning, all, and welcome to today's webinar, Navigating Regulatory and Compliance Developments in 2024 for BC, Canada, and beyond. My name is Anna Rowinska, and I am your technical host today. Thank you so much for joining us. To adjust your audio settings, click the microphone at the bottom left of your screen, then click the up arrow to select audio controls. For chat and Q&A functions, although your microphone is muted, you can ask questions at any time using the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. Please use the comment section to chat with attendees, share your thoughts, and let us know where you are from. Our presenters will respond to as many questions as they can during today's session as well. Our moderator today is Doris Toman, Services Experience Manager at the Manufacturing Safety Alliance of BC. Welcome, Doris.
Thank you, Anna, and welcome everyone. I am joining you from the Fraser Valley office of the Manufacturing Safety Alliance of BC, located in Chilliwack on the traditional and unceded territories of the Stalo Coast Salish people. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak to you from these shared lands today. The Manufacturing Safety Alliance is the not-for-profit health and safety association for manufacturers and food processors in BC. Our team of health and safety experts are here to answer your questions and to assist you towards core certification, the occupational safety standard of excellence for manufacturing. We are here to support the continuous improvement of your health and safety programs to prevent injuries and promote workplace wellness. Call on us anytime for health and safety training, information, tools, or advice. In today's webinar, we will be exploring the ways to track and stay on top of regulatory requirements for BC and other jurisdictions. Our advisory team at the Alliance, of course, is here for you to provide guidance on your health and safety programs and compliance. Your advisor can provide advice and resources to support compliance with the OHS regulation. When operations across multiple jurisdictions, your compliance puzzle can become more complicated. We'll be talking more this fall about a new program that can help you bridge the gap from a certification standpoint. What do you have in place to track and understand the compliance requirements in the areas where you operate today or may consider operating in the future? Are there differences between BC, Alberta, Kelowna, and Toronto? What about in the US or Australia? These are some of the questions that will be answered today by our guests. They will share insights on how to compare and understand these different jurisdictional regulations to proactively support compliance. From Associate Member STP ComplianceEHS, we have Shannon Major, who establishes and nurtures sustainable partnerships with organizations like the Manufacturing Safety Alliance of BC to leverage regulatory content to meet the unique needs of EHS practitioners. STP ComplianceEHS maintain full text content and regulatory monitoring to provide comprehensive, up-to-date coverage for environmental, health and safety, legal and corporate governance issues to help businesses meet compliance obligations and improve business efficiency across the globe. And Megan White is also joining us from Specialty Technical Consultants. She brings 17 years of experience in environmental consulting and regulatory compliance. She has provided regulatory tracking in services and authored audit protocols for companies that operate in several countries and regions, including Canada, the UK, Australia, and the European Union. Before I pass the floor over to Shannon and Megan, a reminder to use the Q&A icon to submit your questions anytime during the session. So right now, I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome Shannon.
Thank you, Doris, and everyone for joining today. We want to take a moment just to highlight that by attending the webinar today, you are actually I just need Megan to share her screen real quick. Here we go. Okay, next slide, Megan. Thanks, everyone. So we just want to start by taking a moment to highlight that you're attending the webinar today. And so, in fact, you are demonstrating proactive approach to compliance, saying that this is really valuable to your organization. You've taken time out of your busy schedules to be informed of not only the existing, but upcoming and proposed environment, health, and safety compliance obligations that may apply to your operations, so that with this knowledge, you can apply further actions or processes that can be taken before any non-compliances occur, which is in a nutshell the definition of proactive compliance. So by taking this proactive approach to compliance, you're not only going to reduce the number of non-compliances that may lead to your workplace incidents and injuries, maybe some negative impacts to the environment or financial fines, maybe stop orders. This approach can also improve your company's reputation, the confidence that in your stakeholders, both internal and external stakeholders. It can contribute to a strong business continuity and resilience. So what else can you do to demonstrate proactive compliance beside attending this webinar and others like this? Consider establishing a compliance management program. This program can follow that plan, do, check, act model, which can control and continually improve processes with the overall objective of improving your performance related to EHS compliance. There's key components of this management program that we highly recommend you include. Processes that include understanding what those compliance obligations are and how do they apply to your organization. Evaluating the risk of the compliance, or if you aren't going to comply with those obligations, what is that going to do to your organization? Identify controls that you have in place that manage those obligations so that you know to put in processes to make sure those controls don't ever fall away. You should integrate those processes and controls into existing business operations. If you're already following a process that you just have to add in a little more, take advantage of that. Reduce the redundancy and the inefficiencies in your operations. You should also evaluate those obligations through periodic inspections, audits, assessments. And finally, you should implement those actions to correct and or control any non-compliances to really continually improve that compliance management system. So our focus for the next little bit of the session is going to be on the planning part of taking a proactive approach to compliance. This is the phase where you need to tackle the scope of your compliance obligations and how they apply to your footprint. This is where you work towards understanding the complexities of the regulatory requirements. And of course, this is where your global footprint becomes to play an important part of the discussion. We're going to emphasize Canada during today's session, but if you do have a global footprint of operations, you know that the regulatory landscape is vast with many unique approaches around the world regarding what constitutes compliance obligations. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Megan, which is STP's partner on content and the experts in the global coverage. So over to you, Megan.
Thanks, Shannon. So nice chatting with everyone today. Hopefully this will be a good session. So to kick things off, I'm going to bring a bit of that global lens to our discussion. So this will involve taking a little bit of a comparative approach on some of the hottest topics that are being regulated today. So pollutant release inventories, GHG reporting, ESG, and EHS implementation. We'll then follow that up with a bit of a lightning round discussion on issues that are a bit closer to home. So this is where we'll really take a little bit of a deeper dive into some of the Canadian specific topics that we're seeing come out. All right, so let's get right into it. Pollutant release inventories. So these are federal inventories of pollutants released to the air, water, and land, including pollutants that were disposed of or recycled. I know we're often focused on NPR reporting here in Canada, but I wanted to showcase a comparison across Canada, US, and Mexico requirements because there's a cross-border story to share. So Canada, Mexico, and the US actually began collaborating through the North American Agreement on Environmental Cooperation, which in turn established the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, or CEC. So Canada's NPRI, maintained by Environment and Climate Change Canada, Mexico's RETC, maintained by the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources, and the US's TRI, maintained by the US EPA, are all affiliated with the CEC. On a regular basis, the CEC is actually publishing a report series presenting data and analysis of pollutant release and transfers reported by North American facilities to their respective inventories. And so that data is actually provided in the integrated database, which is just one example of sharing of data that has had an impact on decision-making by policymakers and industry representatives. So as a result of that collaboration, you'll find that there are actually some commonalities between the various requirements. Taking a deeper dive into Canada, NPRI reporting requirements are provided by the Federal Canadian Environmental Protection Act, 1999. I'll just be using the CEPA acronym moving forward. To find out if the NPRI requirements apply to your facility, you need to ask yourself a few questions. So the first question, do any of the designated activities take place at my facility? And there are 6 types of designated activities that include, for example, operation of stationary combustion equipment. The next, do employees and contractors work for more than 20,000 hours during the year, which equates to about 10 full-time workers. If the answer is yes to either or both of those questions, the follow-up consideration is to determine whether the facility manufactures, processes, or otherwise uses or releases one or more of the listed NPRI substances in a quantity above the threshold for those substances. There are, of course, some exceptions. So, for example, you do not need to report releases, disposals, or transfers if the designated activities involve research or testing, or sale of the substance itself, or products that contain the substance, just to name a couple. The applicability is actually very similar in the US. We have 3 different criteria to meet applicability. The first is being in a covered industry sector. For your reference, that's 40 CFR 372.23. Long list of industry sectors there that are included, everything from manufacturing, metal mining, electric power generation. The second is similar to Canada in the sense that employs 10 or more full-time equivalent employees. So that 20,000 hour threshold works the same in the US. And then the third, manufacturing, importing, processing, or using a TRI listed substance in quantities above the threshold. Now there's some buckets with the US. So for manufacturing, importing, processing, it tends to be about 25,000 pounds per year. For use, it tends to be about 10,000 pounds per year. And then there's even lower thresholds that apply for chemicals of special concern and PFAS. We'll talk a little bit more about PFAS later today. The US has some different exemptions when compared to Canada. Probably the most commonly seen one is the de minimis exemption, and that provides an exemption for processing or otherwise using minimal concentrations of non-PBT chemicals and mixtures or trade name products. So one of the main distinctions with the Mexico RTC, it doesn't have the work hour piece of the puzzle. So it really is just the 2 applicability criteria. One, that you're an applicable industrial establishment. So again, it has a list of applicable industry sectors and activities: power generation, chemical manufacturing, generation of 10 or more tons per year of hazardous waste. And the other piece is manufacturing, processing, using, or releasing one or more of the listed substances in a quantity above the threshold. One other point of note that I would make with Mexico that's a bit of a unique aspect here is that it's actually part of a bigger process of obtaining an annual operation certificate, which is commonly referred to as a COA. The applicable facilities are required to submit an application for a COA to Seminart every year with information that accurately reflects the activities of that facility, including information about these used substances. So you see that there's a time period that I've shown on the slide here in terms of the deadline, and that's because it incorporates the process of both obtaining the COA and also submitting all of the relevant data for obtaining that COA. So as you can see from the slide, a few more commonalities in the sense that everyone has a common online tool. Well, different for the country, but everyone has online reporting functionalities. All countries cover reporting for the previous calendar year, and all countries have a record retention requirement. One last comment before we transition to the next topic. When it comes to toxic substances and hazardous materials, don't forget that there is more to the story. So we have reporting under the Federal Prohibition of Toxic Substances Act in Canada. We have provincial reporting requirements like under the Ontario Spill Prevention and Contingency Plans and BC's Spill Reporting Regulation. And then to take another example, in the US, we have TSCA and Tier 2 reporting. So just to name a few examples that showcase how complex the landscape is for managing these substances and materials. So one of the environmental topics that continues to trend, greenhouse gas reporting, and it's definitely an issue that crosses borders, but there are some specific country and regional requirements that we need to consider. In Canada, at the federal level, the reporting requirements are published in government notices every 1 to 2 years. The most recent notice with respect to reporting of greenhouse gases was published in December of last year, and that covers reporting for 2024 and 2025 calendar year emissions. And just to make a note for your calendar, the next upcoming deadline is actually June 3rd, 2024, and that's for 2023 emissions data. In Canada, the applicable GHGs include carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, sulfur, hexafluoride, and several hydrofluorocarbons and perfluorocarbons. Just to mention some of the recent changes and updates that we've been seeing in the recent notices, you have publication and use of facility GHG emissions by source category. There is a removal of the option for facilities to upload provincial reports. And you have updates of global warming potential values used under the program. And now, as many of you know, the provinces have their own requirements, but in most cases, they do not significantly deviate from the federal legislation. Just an important note to close up before we shift over to the US on Canada anyways. There are some other regulatory initiatives in Canada that are relevant to management of GHG. The Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act is perhaps the most well-known part of the story. The Act establishes a regulatory charge on fuel and a regulatory trading system for large industry known as the Output-Based Pricing System, or OBPS. That provides that persons responsible for the covered facilities are required to provide compensation at the prescribed rate for GHG emissions that exceed the facility's annual emissions limits. So some provinces like Alberta and BC, and most recently Saskatchewan, have actually implemented their own programs that have been approved by the federal government to apply instead of the regulatory federal OBPS requirements. Stay tuned because we're going to talk a little bit about BC OBPS in our local impact lightning round. For the US, the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program, that is 40 CFR Part 98. That requires reporting of GHG data and other relevant information annually for large sources by March 31st of each year. There's a long list of industries that include everything from pulp and paper, fluorinated gas production, industrial wastewater treatment. Again, a long list of applicable industry sectors there. Enforcement is actually a hot topic in the US today. And that's especially because of EPA's national initiative to enforce US hydrofluorocarbon phase down, which includes cracking down on illegal import of HFCs. And this actually falls within the EPA's broader enforcement and compliance initiatives for fiscal years 2024 to 2027, which includes 6 targeted items such as mitigating climate change. And last but not least, we have the EU as our comparative jurisdiction here. Commission Implementing Regulation 2018-2066 is the legislation we're talking about here for monitoring and reporting of GHG. Important to note that this is a regulation. So as a quick refresher on EU legislation, EU regulations are directly applicable for facilities in a member state. Directives, on the other hand, need to be implemented in national legislation for each member state to be directly applicable. So important to note that as a regulation, this broadly is applicable across the EU. Again, we have a broad set of industry sectors that apply, and the reporting covers emissions of 7 key greenhouse gases. With the EU, one thing that's maybe important to note is that it actually falls within the framework of the EU Emissions Trading System, or EU ETS. You'll see reference to Directive 2003/87 EC on the slide, and that's actually the framework directive for the EU ETS. So part of the reporting mechanisms then include national government's use of revenues from the auctioning of allowances in the EU ETS. So what's new with the EU on this topic? On January 1st, 2024, the EU extended its coverage to the maritime sector, and that was part of a bigger set of regulatory reforms that came into force in 2023. Big chunk of the 2023 reforms actually included expanding requirements for the aviation sector. So you can see that the EU has been focusing on broadening the scope of applicability of its GHG emissions reporting framework. ESG, definitely a topic that we didn't want to miss out on for this session. Many of you may already be doing voluntary reporting or looking into the options of doing voluntary reporting, but we're going to focus on what the regulatory landscape looks like. In Canada, we have a few things happening. We have corporate diversity reporting, so corporations having to report on the representation of 4 designated reports, ensuring that their board of directors and senior management teams have women, Indigenous people, peoples with disability, and members of visible minorities. In 2023, we had the standard on the disclosure of greenhouse gas emissions and the setting of reduction targets come into place for suppliers to the Government of Canada. Those suppliers have to disclose GHG emissions and set targets to reduce them. We have Canada's climate investment taxonomy, which kind of aligns with the EU taxonomy for those of you who might have been following along with that. Essentially a framework to establish standardized definitions of climate compatible investment. But most importantly, the CSA, Canadian Securities Administrators. So that's the group of securities regulators from each province and territory, and they've teamed up to develop a harmonized approach to securities regulations across the country. As currently, the initiative here is that the CSA is considering whether and over what time frame the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board standards should be mandated. The CSSB was formed in 2023, and they in turn are actually reviewing the International Sustainability Standards Board standards and trying to pull that in as the global baseline for Canada. Essentially, the idea is that federally regulated financial institutions in Canada, including banks and insurance companies, will have to start ESG reporting targeted for the fiscal year of 2024, and then additional industry sectors would follow. SEC in the US, Securities and Exchange Commission, their proposed rules date back to March 2022. Same kind of deal, requiring disclosure of things like severe weather events and other natural conditions and other ESG related issues in financial reports. They will also require companies to provide support plans to demonstrate how they plan to meet their advertised environmental claims, like a net zero commitment, for example. The US proposal, I would say in general, is aligning with the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, or TCFD. So in other words, that means looking at governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and identifying asset risks at the zip code level. Or postal code, zip code in the US. We're still waiting on a final date for the SEC rules to come into effect. There was talk about October 2023. There's been chatter that it's early 2024, but that's quickly escaping us. So we'll have to see what happens. California is a bit ahead of the game. The new laws, known as Climate Corporate Data Accountability Act 253, SB 253, and Climate-Related Financial Risk Act, SB 261, essentially apply to any large company, whether public or private, doing business in California. It is a very broad scope, so we might see some pushback on that. SB 253 requires US companies with annual revenues exceeding $1 billion doing business in California to disclose Scope 1 and Scope 2 starting in 2026, and Scope 3 of GHG emissions data starting in 2027. No emissions thresholds, so again, very broad scope here. SB 261 is US-based companies with total annual revenues exceeding $500 million that is doing business in California to prepare and submit climate-related financial risk reports. So aligning with the TCFD recommendations, and also requiring submitting of measures that they've adopted to mitigate and adapt those risks. So a little bit of a smaller pool there, a broader net there, and broader scope of requirements. In general, though, I would say hard for North America to continue to drag its feet because the EU is definitely quite far along in its progress of ESG requirements. EU law currently requires all large companies and all listed companies to disclose information on what they see as risks and opportunities. And there's a bit of a phase-in period. So it's starting with listed companies, shifting over to large companies that are not listed. And then, so 1 year, second year, third year would apply to small to medium enterprises as well too. So the intent is that it's going to cover a very large spectrum of companies that are out there in the market, but a phased-in approach. The requirements are actually enforced. So 5th of January 2023, Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive entered into force. The first companies will have to submit reports for the 2024 financial year. So reports due in 2025 for 2024 data. And the companies subject to those requirements will have to report according to the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, which were actually published in December 2023. Quick last note, you'll note that this is a directive, so that does mean that this legislation will have to be implemented in member state-specific national legislation to really be enforceable and fully implemented. So requirements are in place, but stay tuned for what the member states are going to be up to in terms of implementing this. Okay, so transitioning over to our final global impact topic, GHS. So very, very brief history. 1992, United Nations Conference on Environment and Development issued a mandate calling for the development of globally harmonized chemical classification and labeling system. The goal was implementation in 2000. It was officially published in 2002 with the objective that participating countries that were members of the EUN would have to adopt by 2008. Now there's been several revised revisions since then, and we are currently on the 10th revised version, which was published in 2023. We'll have a quick look at some implementation statuses around the world, focusing on workplace requirements. Although it's important to note that there are also relevant requirements that apply to transportation of dangerous goods as well too. But we'll start with a little bit of an overview and a little bit of a deeper dive on the requirements in Canada. So in Canada, we have the Workplace Hazardous Materials Information System, or WHMIS. That's the umbrella framework for implementing GHS requirements in Canada. So we're talking hazard classification, cautionary label of containers, provision of safety data sheets, and worker education and training. Those are really the four main tenets to WHMIS. It's implemented through coordinated federal, provincial, and territorial legislation. So essentially each agency in those 13 jurisdictions are responsible for occupational health and safety must establish their own employer WHMIS requirements. At federal level, WHMIS is implemented through the Hazardous Products Act and the regulations. That was in 2015. And the deadline for compliance was December 1st, 2018. Essentially, all suppliers of workplace hazardous products and all employers with such products in their workplaces were required to be in compliance with the legislation. I just wanted to call to note that most recently Canada published amending legislation to the Hazardous Products Act and regulations. And the intent of those amendments was to implement the 7th revised edition and some provisions of the 8th revised edition. The intent was also to align with the US proposed rules that are coming out as well too. There's a little bit of a transition period. So I think December 14th, 2025 is the date to target for compliance with the new updated requirements. They include things like there's some improved just clarity and precision. There's new information elements required for safety data sheets and labels. A new physical hazard class called chemicals under pressure and associated requirements for that hazard class. There's a change in a name. So flammable aerosols has become aerosols, a new hazard category for non-flammable aerosols. And I think the last one, subcategorization of flammable gases. So that's kind of shifted from category 1 to 1A and 1B. And that includes pyrophoric gases and chemically unstable gases in that subcategory 1A. All right, so just kind of doing a little bit of a snapshot of what's happening around the world. So for the US, OSHA issued a proposed rulemaking back in 2021. And this was also an intent to align with the 7th revision. Amendments included things like updating hazard classes and hazard categories, updated SDS sections 9 and 11. But we still have not seen a date yet for when this is officially going to become effective. So we'll have to stay tuned for that. Brazil is on the 5th revision, and the ordinance number 26 on hazard communication is the primary legislation, but they've also published some technical guidance. So 2013, they published technical guidelines on safety data sheets, and then 2014, some on labeling. India has not actually officially adopted GHS for chemicals yet. The current SDS requirements are provided in Schedule 9 of the Manufacture, Storage, and Import of Hazardous Chemicals Rule 1989. But in 2020, India published some draft legislations to do a complete overhaul. I think they're currently called the Chemicals Management and Safety Rules. They will actually implement GHS in India, so stay tuned for that. Another example, China has Decree 59 and a total of 28 GHS compulsory national standards. These fully align with the 4th revision of GHS, but we haven't really seen too much activity from China since then. And then finally, the EU, Regulation 1272/2008 on classification, labeling, and packaging of substances and mixtures, otherwise known as the CLP regulation. So note regulation again, so this is directly applicable requirements, but of course we have member states who have implemented their own legislation to enforce and enhance the EU CLP regulation. There is a major proposed revision to CLP that was published in 2022, and actually we saw some traction on that in December of last year. The European Parliament and Council reached an agreement about the revisions, and so we probably are going to see a final version of these amendments coming pretty soon. So some of the changes to be expected, there's some updates to rules on classifying complex substances, first ever rules on refillable chemicals, clear labeling of hazardous chemicals. There's better protection of consumers when buying hazardous chemicals online. So for example, websites will have to display hazardous properties of the products. And also the possibility of businesses to use fold-out labels and digital labeling, but still being required to maintain some of that critical safety information like hazard pictograms required on the pack. So transitioning from that global lens, we'll sort of look into some more closer to home issues. Now, I should mention that these new developments and proposed initiatives that we're going to quickly do a lightning round of are by no means comprehensive. We just wanted to give you an idea of some of the most interesting topics that we've been seeing come out in the recent little while. So just to sort of federal level, late last year, Transport Canada introduced an amendment creating an entirely new part of requirements for those who handle, offer for transport, or import dangerous goods. So the new requirement is to register with the government. They built in a little bit of a transition period, so there's about a year to be able to transition to the new requirements. Wasn't really expecting to see a lot of changes with the transportation of dangerous goods regulations, but this was a little bit of a big one to see that entirely new part. The good news is that it wasn't quite as stringent as was originally expected in the opening drafts of the proposal. So scale back a little bit, but still enforce and still worth taking a peek at. Those amendments also included some updates to the special cases in Part 1 of the regs, which provide exemptions to parts of the TEG that don't apply in certain cases. Next up, we had a supply chain related update. This actually ties into our previous ESG discussion today. New measures introduced through the Fighting Against Forced Labor and Child Labor in Supply Chains Act. So the act imposes an obligation on certain government institutions and private sector entities to report on the measures taken to prevent and reduce the risk of forced labor and child labor in by the actual companies and in the supply chains as well too. The Act has an inspection regime. It gives the power to the minister to collect additional information from impacted entities. And it also allows for prohibition on the importation of goods manufactured or produced in whole or in part by forced labor or child labor. Shifting over to BC, I would be remiss if I didn't mention a couple of the critical updates that have happened in BC, including amendments to the occupational first aid requirements and the new return to work legislation. But I'm not going to talk too much about those. The Safety Alliance has already very successfully tackled these topics for you. I think we're going to try to share some links in the chat here about these ones. They have some great resources there, including recording of webinars that the Safety Alliance has recently hosted on those two topics. Next up for BC, we have the carbon pricing system. And so, as promised, the BC OBPS. As of April 1st, 2024, the new BC OBPS will become effective and will replace the Clean BC Industrial Incentive Program. So mandatory for large industries. It puts a price on emissions for all regulated industrial facilities that emit more than 10,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. Among other things, it also allows smaller facilities to voluntarily participate in the system, and it adopts various measures that promote clean energy technology and using that within the system. And finally, for BC, we have the new single-use and plastic waste prevention regulation, which replaced a previous version of the legislation. These regulations address plastic bag prohibitions, sales charges, and restrictions on single-use plastic accessories. In Ontario, there were a lot of changes throughout 23, as usual. But one thing that I noticed of particular note was there was a lot that impacted the construction industry. So construction projects specifically, we're talking about updates to OREG 21391. So OREG 24123 made numerous changes to crane safety rules, new design, installation, maintenance, inspection, record-keeping requirements. An interesting one to note because I know crane safety has been an important recent topic in BC of late. OREG 24223, it made changes to circumstances in which an employer must submit a Section 51 or 52 report in the event of an incident resulting in fatalities, critical injuries, or occupational illnesses. There's actually a new reportable incident that was defined. So it's a reportable incident if it occurs due to failure to control a crane or load, including any rigging failure. And then finally, we also had OREG 6123, which made various safety protection updates for construction projects, primarily related to PPE use, and access to washroom and other sanitary amenities. Proposed initiatives, we have modernizing SEPA, so Bill S5, Strengthening Environmental Protection for a Healthier Canada Act. It received royal assent in June 2023. The bill modernizes SEPA by recognizing the right to healthy environment, strengthens Canada's chemical management regime, and builds in some additional transparency measures. And I mention this because as part of this initiative, there are several consultations either ongoing or planned. So just to give you an example, until April 8th, 2024, you can comment on the discussion document on the implementation framework for a right to a healthy environment under SEPA. Plastics. December 30th, 2023, there was a notice of intent to publish requirements for reporting of certain plastic manufactured items for 2024, 2025, and 26. The consultation just closed a couple of weeks ago, but it will implement a requirement for producers of plastic products to provide information on the life cycle of products. Next up, PFAS, otherwise known as per or polyfluoroalkyl substances, widely used, long-lasting chemicals found in a very wide range of applications, consumer, commercial, industrial products, and lots happening there in Canada. So Health Canada, for example, published a technical document to provide regulatory authorities and decision makers with an objective for PFAS in Canadian drinking water supplies. And perhaps the most important, Canada is considering activities that address PFAS as a class rather than as individual substances. So the intent there would be to add PFAS as a class of substances to the list of toxic substances under Schedule 1 of SEPA. And so inevitably that means more stringent requirements. And finally, the CMP initiative. So this dates back to 2006. Canada's been doing assessments and adopting measures for over 4,000 prioritized substances. This notice represented the remaining 65 substances that still need to be assessed. And intention is for all the assessments to be completed by the end of March of this year. Inevitably, with the new assessments, new measures get implemented, which could be as simple as more reporting requirements for the listed substances. I also just recommend taking a peek at some of the provincial initiatives. So in Ontario, there's quite a bit of activity on extended producer responsibility. You could see the consultations that are ongoing through Ontario's Resource Productivity and Recovery Authority, or RPRA. Essentially, that's the regulator mandated by the government of Ontario to enforce the province's circular economy laws. And of course, as you know, WorkSafe BC consultations. For example, through April 26th, you can comment on proposed amendments to policy on activity related to soft tissue disorders of the limbs. And then finally, we have enforcement measures. So didn't really want to take a deep dive into enforcement measures today, but I just figured we would provide a few sources that might be useful in terms of seeing what the agencies have in mind. I'll just point out a couple of quick examples. BC, the 2024 planned inspectional initiatives are released. So continuing to emphasize risk management basics. In Ontario, there was an official initiative to expand the application of environmental penalties to specific landfilling sites, but it's actually part of a broader initiative to expand administrative penalties more generally for environmental contraventions. Okay, so from a local perspective, we've kind of wrapped up some very quick lightning round topics to discuss here. And if you'll remember right on the early agenda slide, we were also going to tackle compliance support. So all the government agencies we've mentioned today, great place to start. The 3 organizations we have on the webinar today, another great place to start. The Safety Alliance provides valuable services supporting its members with understanding new legislation and helping them align and implement programs. STC, we've been in the EHS consulting world for 25 years now, providing practical boots on the ground, consulting across North America, and regulatory information services for compliance obligations around the world. And finally, STP. So I'm going to turn it over to Shannon to showcase a bit about what STP brings to the table.
Thanks, Megan. Wow, that was a lot of information. Yeah, so to highlight STP, and there was a bit of intro to us at the very beginning of the webinar, but we've been in business for over 35 years. We provide regulatory content in the EHS and more expanded scope of ESG for our regulatory requirements and monitoring. We are a fully digital cloud-based platform where we deliver both the audit and regulatory compliance content for practitioners like yourself, both locally in BC, across Canada, and globally. Our content is developed by senior EHS practitioners, Megan being an example of one, where they are experienced in the jurisdiction that they are writing the content. So we can ensure that you have that top quality and accuracy of the content for you and local teams. STP, we started at the top of our product with we call our Reg Apply tool. It's an applicability screening questionnaire where you go through answering yes, no, not applicable questions that are going to build out your company profile and further tailor what the regulatory requirements that apply to the desired scope of your organization. It provides a really efficient and effective way to build out what are those obligations that apply to you. Once you've done that, use that tool, you can use it to tailor a register that of the requirements and send that over for our monitoring, which I'll highlight on the next slide. But you can also build like an audit checklist of all the requirements that you need to follow, which would be on our Audit Hub side. We provide monitoring on a at least weekly basis here in BC and in Canada, as well as US, providing both proposed and final requirements that have been issued by the regulatory agencies. And we actually complement that with a full text library of the acts and regulations with a search feature as well. We also provide the consulting packages to support both a seamless and more efficient implementation of the product. And I think the key here is that we're going to deliver the content to you, but where the Safety Alliance is really going to help out is really troubleshoot the hows and the what does this really mean to me, and can you help me implement at the site if you need. So let's take a look more in depth of what the products are. On our monitoring side, it's our STP Reg Hub. We offer you the ability to customize the register based on the jurisdiction that you're in. So Canada, BC, if you want. The collection type. So do you want to look at your acts, your regulations, guidance, standards? The status type. So you can pick, do you want to get alerts based on your proposed and final, or just proposed? And you can build that at a topic level or at the citation level. And by citation, I mean the section. So section 5 of the BC Safety Code, etc. Once you've selected and tailored that, which is really quick clicks of the button, you will receive regular emails. It's kind of shown in that bottom left-hand side of your screen there, where that email will come to you based on that desired frequency. So it's at least weekly, but maybe you don't want your email every week. You can move that to every 2, 3, 4 weeks, more monthly, etc. And we provide that summary of the change, nice there in the middle there. We highlight the agency that has issued that. It's also including the summary. If it's a final measure, this is a regulatory notification, but if it was a final act or regulation, you would have the effective date. So when did it come into effect, as well as when the agency published it. We provide the citation if it's a direct act regulation citation. And that hyperlink that we offer you is to the full text that was offered by the regulatory agency itself, so you can understand the background of what's provided. Next slide, just to give you a complimentary service, especially in Canada and the US, we have a full text library of all the EHS acts and regulations that you need, all in one place. So if you wanted to take a look at what is that full requirement, you can access it through our library. There's kind of an example here. You can also build your reg register of all the requirements really quickly using that full text as the source of content. And we also show in both our audit content, which I'll show in the next slide, is a hyperlink that goes directly to that full text. So you don't need to navigate all the regulations. When you click our hyperlink, it's going to take you directly to the citation. And the last slide, just following up on our audit hub side, we do essentially have our senior practitioners going through and dissecting and disseminating all that information into very easy to use audit statements or requirements that you can implement at your site. We provide guide notes, so that's the overall statement of what is needed of you, but the guide notes is that individual itty-gritty that will really help you have a consistent audit program or implementation of requirements. Within our product, though, our publication that we offer, a bit more we offer is regulatory summaries. So we have kind of a blurb of what is the acts, what are the regulations. That's really good for a training perspective if you have people joining your team that really has no idea what these things mean. We include reference tables and appendices of the regulations where it makes sense to refer to. And something really fun, if you have an audit program and you're building that pre-audit questionnaire, we actually have done that for you in each of our subtopics. We've highlighted what pre-audit information you'll need, both for the site to collect or for you to prepare before you go out and do the assessment. And just the final thing is we do provide this in local languages as well for many of our jurisdictions. So if from an accessibility and a communication standpoint, really, really cool because you can translate both from the English and the local language as need be. So in summary, STP provides that EHS regulatory content to support your organization with a continuous proactive approach to compliance. And I'm just going to finish off here. We were asked to do a little like reminder. If it hasn't come to your inbox, please take out your phone, do a little snap of the VR code there. We are welcome you to join our webinar that I will also be hosting on Thursday this week, 11 o'clock Eastern time, where I'm going to navigate ISO 14000 and 45001, really digging into like how our STP product can support you through not only the very obvious section 6 of the standards, but all of the sections of the standard for management systems. So with that, I'll pass it back over.
Thank you. Wow, that was a lot of information, Shannon and Megan. Thank you for sharing this today on the OHS regulations beyond for BC and beyond.